When people hear the word war, they are usually told a simple story: that wars happen to defend freedom, protect democracy, stop evil, or respond to aggression. But history shows that these explanations are often the surface narrative rather than the real engine driving conflict. Because beneath almost every major war lies a complex web of economic incentives, resource competition, financial systems, and power preservation. And once you start following the money, instead of the speeches, a very different picture emerges. One where nations behave less like moral actors and more like corporations competing for market share, supply chains, and long-term dominance. And this is not a conspiracy theory, but a pattern documented repeatedly across centuries. From ancient empires fighting over trade routes to modern states maneuvering for control over oil, gas, rare earth minerals, labor markets, and strategic geography. Because war at its core is often a tool for restructuring economic power when peaceful methods are no longer sufficient. And for ruling elites, war can solve problems that domestic policy cannot, such as economic stagnation, debt pressure, declining global influence, or internal unrest. Since conflict allows governments to justify massive spending, centralize authority, suppress dissent, and redirect public frustration toward an external enemy, while simultaneously creating enormous financial opportunities for industries connected to defense, energy, construction, logistics, and finance, which is why the military-industrial ecosystem tends to expand regardless of who wins on the battlefield. And why wars are rarely accidental, but instead emerge at moments when economic interests align with political ambition. Because maintaining global dominance requires access to resources, control over trade corridors, influence over currency systems, and the ability to enforce economic rules. And when those elements are threatened, Teehee language of freedom becomes a convenient moral wrapper for actions driven by material necessity. As seen repeatedly in modern history, where interventions were framed as humanitarian while coincidentally occurring in regions rich in oil, gas, minerals, or strategic shipping lanes, and even when leaders genuinely believe in ideological causes, they operate within systems that reward economic expansion and punish decline. Meaning that nations that fail to secure resources or markets risk falling behind competitors, losing currency strength, suffering unemployment, and facing political instability. So war becomes an extension of economic policy by other means, particularly in a global system where growth is expected every year and stagnation is treated as failure. Because in such a system, there is little tolerance for equilibrium. And powerful states must continuously expand their influence or risk being replaced by rising rivals. Which explains why emerging powers and established powers so often collide. It's not because they hate each other's values, but because they are competing for the same finite economic advantages. Whether that is access to cheap labor, control of technological supply chains, dominance over financial institutions, or leverage over global energy flows. And this competition intensifies during periods of economic stress, such as recessions, inflationary cycles, or debt crises. When governments face pressure to deliver growth at home while protecting their position abroad. And historically, these periods have coincided with increased militarization and conflict because war creates demand, absorbs labor, stimulates production, and allows governments to borrow and spend on a scale that would be politically impossible in peacetime, all while framing these actions as necessary for national survival. Which is why defense budgets often expand even when social programs are cut, why arms manufacturing remains one of the most politically protected industries in the world, employing millions, funding research, influencing policy, and shaping foreign relations. Creating a feedback loop where economic dependency on defense spending makes peace less profitable than conflict, not just financially, but politically. Because leaders who challenge this system risk backlash from powerful stakeholders, while those who support it are rewarded with campaign funding, media support, and institutional backing. And at the international level, war also serves as a mechanism for enforcing economic hierarchies, ensuring that weaker states remain dependent on stronger ones for security. Loans, technology, and market access, often locking them into cycles of debt and extraction that benefit global financial centers. which is why post-war reconstruction frequently involves contracts awarded to foreign corporations, loans issued by international institutions, economic reforms that open local markets to external control, effectively turning destruction into a business opportunity. And while citizens are told that sacrifices are necessary for freedom, the long-term economic gains tend to flow upward rather than outward, concentrating wealth and power among those already positioned to benefit, which helps explain why wars continue even when public support declines. Because the costs are socialized while the profits are privatized. And this pattern becomes even clearer when examining how wars are prepared long before the first shot is fired. Through economic sanctions, trade disputes, currency manipulation, and political pressure. All of which are forms of economic warfare designed to weaken an opponent's financial stability, provoke internal conflict, or force strategic concessions. And when these measures fail, military action becomes the final enforcement tool. Not as a sudden moral response, but as the culmination of prolonged economic struggle. And this reality challenges the comforting belief that wars are fought primarily for noble ideals, because while ideals may motivate individuals, states operate according to incentives, and the incentive structure of the global system rewards expansion, dominance, and control over resources, not restraint, cooperation, or equality. Which means that as long as economic systems prioritize growth over sustainability and competition over cooperation, conflict will remain a recurring feature rather than an exception, regardless of the language used to justify it. And understanding this does not mean denying the human cost or the suffering involved, but rather recognizing that peace requires more than good intentions. It requires restructuring the economic incentives that make war profitable and decline unacceptable. Because until nations can achieve stability without constant expansion and power without coercion, the economic reasons for war will continue to quietly shape global events, hidden behind flags, speeches, and slogans that distract from the financial reality underneath. If economics is the engine of war, then resources are the fuel. And throughout history, control over valuable resources has been one of the most consistent predictors of conflict, because resources determine not only wealth but survival, industrial capacity, and geopolitical leverage, and when a nation depends heavily on materials it does not control, it becomes vulnerable, which is why states are willing to go to extreme lengths to secure access to energy, minerals, food, and strategic land, even when the public narrative focuses on ideology or security. Because modern economies are not self-sustaining systems, but deeply interconnected networks that rely on steady flows of raw materials and energy. And any disruption to those flows can trigger inflation, unemployment, political unrest, and loss of global influence, making resource security a national priority on par with military defense, which explains why oil-rich regions have experienced disproportionate levels of foreign intervention, regime change, and prolonged instability, not because these areas are uniquely prone to conflict, but because energy remains the backbone of industrial civilization, powering transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, military operations themselves. And when a country controls energy supply, it gains leverage over pricing, alliances, and policy decisions far beyond its borders, allowing it to influence global markets without firing a single shot. While countries that lack such control must either submit to unfavorable terms or seek alternative methods to secure supply, including political pressure, covert operations, or outright war. And this dynamic extends far beyond oil into natural gas, rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, water access, and even agricultural land, as the modern world transitions into technology-driven economies where batteries, semiconductors, and digital infrastructure depend on materials concentrated in a handful of regions, creating new fault lines for future conflict. Because whoever controls these supply chains controls the pace of technological advancement, military modernization, and economic growth. And this is why competition over resources is rarely framed honestly, since admitting that a war is about maintaining access to cheap energy or strategic minerals would undermine public support. So instead, these conflicts are sold as defensive actions, peacekeeping missions, or moral obligations, while the underlying objective remains economic dominance. And this dominance is not just about extraction, but about who sets the rules of trade, who prices the commodities, who ensures the shipments, and whose currency is used to settle transactions. Because financial control amplifies resource control, allowing powerful nations to benefit even when resources are located elsewhere. Through trade agreements, sanctions regimes, and investment structures that funnel profits outward, often leaving resource-rich countries trapped in cycles of dependency and underdevelopment. A phenomenon sometimes referred to as the resource paradox, where abundance leads not to prosperity, but to instability, corruption, and foreign interference, because external powers have a vested interest in keeping these regions weak enough to exploit but stable enough to extract from. And when that balance is threatened by nationalist movements, economic reforms, or attempts to assert sovereignty over resources, tensions escalate rapidly, often culminating in economic warfare first and military conflicts second. As sanctions are imposed, currencies are attacked, credit is withdrawn, and internal divisions are amplified, all designed to make resistance economically unbearable. And when these tools fail, military force becomes the final guarantor of access, justified under the language of security or humanitarian concern, but rooted in the fear of losing strategic advantage. And this pattern becomes even clearer when examining trade routes and choke points, such as straits, canals, and ports, which function as arteries of global commerce. Because controlling these locations allows nations to disrupt competitors, protect allies, and extract economic rents. It's making them perpetual flashpoints for conflict regardless of era. As seen historically with empires rising and falling based on their ability to secure and defend trade corridors, and in the modern era, where just-in-time supply chains dominate, the vulnerability of these routes has increased, meaning that even temporary disruptions can have global consequences, raising prices, halting production, and triggering political backlash, which in turn incentivizes military presence and escalation under the guise of stability. And this logic also explains why military bases are often located far from a nation's borders, positioned instead near resources routes, in regions of economic importance, because power projection is less about defense and more about deterrence and influence, ensuring that rivals think twice before challenging existing economic arrangements. And while this system is presented as maintaining global order, it effectively locks in advantages for those already at the top, making upward mobility for developing nations difficult without confrontation. Because peaceful integration into the system often requires accepting unequal terms, limited sovereignty, and exposure to financial volatility controlled by external actors, which creates resentment and resistance that further destabilize regions, reinforcing the cycle of intervention and conflict. And at the domestic level, resource-driven wars are often sold to citizens as necessary sacrifices for national security, even though the benefits are unevenly distributed, with consumers facing higher prices, soldiers bearing physical and psychological costs, and taxpayers funding massive expenditures, while corporations tied to extraction, energy, infrastructure, secure long-term contracts, and record profits, creating a misalignment between public interest and elite incentives that makes accountability difficult, especially when media narratives focus on short-term events rather than long-term economic patterns. And this disconnect allows conflicts to persist far longer than their stated objectives would suggest, because ending a war does not necessarily end the economic interests that depend on it. And in some cases, instability itself becomes profitable, allowing external actors to negotiate favorable deals, influence leadership transitions, and reshape markets under conditions that would be impossible in stable environments. And as global demand continues to rise while resources remain finite, this competition is likely to intensify rather than diminish, particularly as climate change, population growth, and technological transitions place additional strain on water, arable land, and energy systems, increasing the strategic value of regions previously considered peripheral. And unless global economic structures evolve to prioritize cooperation, sustainability, and shared development over extraction and control, the pressure to secure resources through force will remain embedded in the system, not because leaders are inherently aggressive, but because the incentives reward those who act first and punish those who fall behind, making war not an anomaly, but a predictable outcome of an economic order built on scarcity. competition, and unequal power distribution. Beyond resources and trade routes, one of the least discussed yet most powerful economic drivers of war is the role of debt, currency dominance, and the global financial system itself, because modern wars are not only fought with weapons, but with balance sheets, interest rates, and monetary control. And for many nations, especially major powers, war becomes a mechanism to manage economic contradictions that cannot be resolved through normal policy, such as excessive debt, slowing growth, declining productivity, or challenges to currency supremacy. Since the global economy is built on confidence, and confidence depends on the perception of stability, strength, and enforcement power, which means that countries issuing dominant currencies or controlling major financial institutions must constantly reinforce their authority to prevent rivals from undermining the system. And historically, moments when a dominant power's economic position is questioned have often coincided with increased military activity, not as an act of desperation, but as a signal to markets, allies, and competitors that the existing order will be defended. Because currency dominance allows a nation to borrow cheaply, run deficits, import real goods in exchange for paper or digital money, and finance large military and social programs without immediate consequences. But this privilege only exists as long as others trust the system and accept its rules. And when alternative currencies, payment systems, or trade arrangements begin to emerge, that trust can weaken, threatening the entire economic model, which reach strong incentives to maintain influence over global finance through political pressure, sanctions, and, when necessary, force. And this is why financial tools are often the first stage of modern conflict. As sanctions restrict access to capital, freeze assets, disrupt trade, and destabilize currencies, effectively acting as acts of war without troops, because they aim to create internal economic pain severe enough to force political change. And while these measures are framed as peaceful alternatives, they can devastate civilian economies, leading to inflation, shortages, unemployment, and social unrest, which in turn increases the likelihood of escalation, especially when targeted nations respond by seeking new alliances, alternative financial systems, or greater economic self-sufficiency, challenging the dominance of existing powers. And at the same time, war itself becomes a financial instrument, allowing governments to justify massive borrowing, expand money supply, and redirect economic output toward military production, absorbing unemployment and stimulating industries tied to defense, logistics, and technology, while postponing difficult structural reforms that might be politically unpopular. Because war creates urgency and unity narratives that suppress criticism and normalize extraordinary economic measures, such as deficit spending, central bank intervention, and price controls, which would otherwise face resistance, making conflict a temporary solution to systemic economic stress, even though it often worsens long-term instability. And this dynamic is particularly visible in how defense spending functions as a form of industrial policy, sustaining advanced manufacturing, research and development, and technological innovation, often with spillover effects into civilian markets, meaning that military investment is not just about security, but about maintaining economic competitiveness in high-value sectors, which creates pressure to sustain perceived threats even when diplomatic solutions exist, because without them, funding streams and political support may decline. And this incentive structure is reinforced by financial markets themselves, where defense contractors, energy firms, and reconstruction companies benefit from conflict-driven volatility, attracting investment and influencing policy through lobbying and media narratives that emphasize danger and uncertainty, while downplaying economic motives and beyond national borders. War also plays a role in resetting global financial relationships, as conflicts can weaken rival economies, destroy infrastructure, and force countries into dependency on external financing aid. And reconstruction loans, often denominated in dominant currencies and tied to conditions that reshape domestic policy, opening markets, privatizing assets, and aligning economic systems with external interests, effectively extending influence through financial means long after the fighting stops. And this process transforms war from a short-term event into a long-term economic restructuring tool, where the battlefield outcome matters less than the post-war financial architecture, because control over institutions, regulations, and capital flows determines who truly benefits. And this is why wars are often followed by conferences, agreements, and rebuilding programs that appear humanitarian, but function as mechanisms for integrating defeated or weakened states into a global economic order on unequal terms, ensuring access to labor, resources, and markets while limiting independent development paths. And even within victorious nations, the economic consequences of war are uneven. As ordinary citizens face inflation, higher taxes, reduced social spending, and long-term debt obligations, while financial institutions and large corporations secure guaranteed returns through government, contracts, and debt instruments, reinforcing wealth concentration and political influence, which makes future conflicts more likely rather than less, because those with the power to shape policy benefit from instability, while those who bear the costs have limited influence over decisions. And this imbalance is sustained by narratives that frame economic sacrifice as patriotic duty, discouraging scrutiny of who profits and who pays. And over time, repeated reliance on war as an economic stabilizer erodes democratic accountability as emergency powers become normalized. Dissent is equated with disloyalty, and economic transparency declines, allowing financial decisions with long-term consequences to be made without public consent. And in a global system where multiple powers face rising debt, aging populations, technological disruption, and slowing growth, these pressures are likely to intensify, increasing the temptation to externalize economic problems through confrontation rather than internal reform, especially as competition over currency influence, financial infrastructure, and technological standards becomes more pronounced. It's creating a future where wars may be increasingly justified not only by security threats, but by economic necessity framed as inevitability. And understanding this pattern is crucial because it reveals that preventing conflict is not just a matter of diplomacy or morality, but of restructuring the financial incentives that reward instability, debt expansion, and dominance. Since as long as the global economy relies on systems where power is maintained through coercion and growth is prioritized over resilience, war will remain an embedded feature rather than a failure of the system, hidden behind complex financial mechanisms that make economic motives harder to see but no less decisive in shaping the course of history.